Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's great books. I'm your host, Eric Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 200 of the great books over the next 10 years and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each of the great books. Well, today I have a special episode, and I'm going to do my 2024 reading recap. I do this each year. It's one of my favorite podcast episodes that I do. And what I do is I just set all the books on my desk right next to me here, where I'm recording this episode, and I pick them up and I share what I remember about each book. I'm going to do a little differently in this episode, where I'm not going to pick up every single book this year, but I'll pick up the big ones and the major ones and share some things from each of those books. But I also want to take a step back and just kind of look at the reading year as a whole, identify some overarching ideas, highlight some of the best ofs, like the top 5 and other top books. And then I'll close out by looking ahead at this reading year, 2025. Well, real quickly, if you're unfamiliar with the Books of Titans project, I am on a quest to read the greatest books ever written. So I started in 2017, and at that time I started with a goal of reading 52 books per year. I was not in a great books reading list or anything at that point, and so what I would do is just kind of collect book ideas throughout the year. These would come from a variety of sources, but they were books that I really wanted to read. And then I would randomize the order and just read one book at a time, with a goal of reading roughly one book a week. And so I started 2017 and did that until 2022. And then I shifted the project 2 years ago in 2023 to begin reading through the great books. So I started to realize and started to learn that that some books were much more important than others. And so I started seeing things about these lists of great books, and it got me intrigued. I'd been buying some of these books over the years with a desire to read them, but just had never read them. And these are the books that have influenced all the others. And so I made a list of a bunch of these books written by roughly 200 authors throughout time, and just made a decision to start going through those. I figure it's going to take 15 years to get through all of these books, and so that's the process I'm in right now. So my 2024 reading list was the second year of reading through those great books, and I referred to 2024 as my big fat Greek reading list, because just chronologically, nearly everything came from ancient Greece that I read last year. And so I am trying to read these books in chronological order. And so I read, last year I read Greek epic poetry, Greek history, tragedies, and even some fables. And so just had a blast doing that. And I'll kind of cover some of that scope of the year as well in this episode. It was easily the most enjoyable reading year of my entire life. I had someone ask me the other day, are you doing this as just kind of something to check off the list? Like, it's great books, you just want to check them off that you've read them. And I said, it may have started like that to some degree, but it got to the point where I'm just enjoying these so much, and I can't believe I haven't read these books before, and wish I would have started earlier. But yeah, it's become so enjoyable, and these books are so good and so deep and so rich that I'm just absolutely loving this. So I do this recap episode at the end of each year, and it is just a fun way to look back over the year, but also to identify shifts in my own thinking, and then consider some of my favorite books from the year. My hope is that in this episode that you get introduced to some books that you may want to read. Just overall reading stats for the entire year, I read 41 books. There were 14,167 pages in those books, and so I averaged 39 pages per day, and my total reading time for the year was 408 hours, 15 minutes, and 38 seconds. And I know that is nerdy to know that or to track that, but I just have this app on my phone where anytime I start reading, I hit start, and then when I stop reading, I hit end. And I just like to know how long it takes me to read certain books. Like, how long does it take someone to read the Iliad. And I'm a pretty slow reader, so when I share those numbers, I think it's a pretty good gauge on how long it might take you to read those books. The longest book was the Hebrew Bible, the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, and that took me 37 hours and 42 minutes, and the shortest book was just an hour and 57 minutes. So whole range of different size books and all that. So let me go next segment here, go into the structure for the year. And then in segment 3, I will cover the main books for this reading year and some things I learned from each one. And then in segment 4, the final segment, I'll cover the one thing, my one key takeaway from the entire year, share some top lists, like top 5, and share some insights that I gathered from this year of reading. Well, I split each reading year into 5 different parts, and I view it kind of as a school year in a way. I just have a personal desire to read through the Bible every year, so I start each year reading the Bible, and that takes me 2 months. I just actually am in that reading part of my year right now in 2025, and this is my 4th time doing it, and each time I've ended right on the final day of February. So I know it's going to take two months, and I just start at the beginning. I start in Genesis and I read all the way to the end. So that's how I started 2024 in January and February, is reading straight through the Bible. And then I get into the great books. So March through June is great books. And again, I just read them in chronological order, one at a time. So whatever is next on the list, that's what I'm reading. In July, I take a break. I call that my summer break. And that's when I get to read some books that are more modern, or just ones that have been recommended to me or gifted to me, or even I'm the business manager at a bookstore in Franklin, Tennessee. It's called Landmark Books, Landmark Booksellers, and we have a number of events. And so sometimes I like to read the books of the authors who we have for events. So I do that in my break months. I'm back to the great books in August, and I call that my fall semester. In the earlier semester, I call that my spring semester. So fall semester is August through November. And then December, I close out the year with another break. I call that my winter break. So that's how I split each reading year. I love it because I describe it this way: like the Bible, the great books, those segments, those are the books that I choose. But my summer break and winter break, that's where I say that's where the books chose me. And again, it's if I've heard a lot about it, if someone's recommended it to me. So what it does is offer a great balance between a planned reading list, but also room for serendipity and room for books that I come across along the year. And sometimes those books just end up being wonderful. But it also limits that to where I'm not just reading modern books, but I'm also making a concerted effort of 8 months out of every year is devoted to the great books. So for 2024, like I mentioned, almost everything was from Greece. It was my big fat Greek reading list. And my overall plan for the great books was to pick out 200 authors and then at most read 2 of their works. I didn't want to get bogged down, but there are some authors where I want to read all of their works. So Shakespeare, I'll probably try to get through a majority of the works, if not all of them, if I can. And that'll probably take a whole year. But there are some authors where I'm going to read all of their works. But otherwise, if an author has 10 books, I want to try to narrow it down just to 2, just so I'm not doing this for the next 50 years of my life. But this year, with that in mind, I started with the Bible, and I started with the Robert Alter translation of the Hebrew Bible, which was excellent. And then the first book that I came to was the Iliad. And I had read that last year. So for Homer, I wanted to read both the Iliad and the Odyssey twice, just to make sure I really got the stories down, understood it well. I even joined a Catherine Project reading group to discuss those two epic works with other students, and that ended up just being fantastic. But last year I read through the Iliad once, the Odyssey twice, and so I still had that second reading of the Iliad to do. So that's how I started things off in March, and then I read a few other things, and then got to the tragedies. And my plan was to just read 2 tragedies by each of the 3 great Greek tragedy playwrights of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. But I got into the tragedies and I loved them so much that I decided to read every single tragedy by these playwrights. And so Aeschylus had written 7 that survive. Sophocles also has 7 that survive, and then Euripides has 19. I think what I'm going to do with Euripides in 2025 is to leave one remaining that I haven't read, just so I haven't read all of the remaining tragedies, because I just can't bear that thought. So anyway, back to the tragedies. I had this plan to just read 2, but I loved them so much, and they only take like 2 to 3 hours to read per tragedy. So I just said, you know what? I'm going to read every single tragedy here. I really like these and really want to do that. So that ended up taking a lot longer than I thought it would, but I'm glad I did that, and I'll get into more details in the next segment on that. I then went into some of the Greek history, so Thucydides and Xenophon, and I read Herodotus last year and loved it. Just absolutely loved Herodotus. He's my favorite historian so far. Thucydides and Xenophon, I joined a Catherine Project group, and so where we read those works, and so that's part of the reason I had those in this year's reading list. I also read Aesop's Fables, and then just read a number of different books in those break months. So majority of this year was spent on the tragedy writers, but it started with Homer's Iliad, which is now my favorite book, and kind of closed out with some of the Greek history. So let me dive into some of these individual books that I read in the next segment here. So each year for the Bible, I select a different version of the Bible. I like reading different translations, and I find that sometimes if I've gotten acquainted with a certain version of the Bible, I can kind of just hear it or read it and it doesn't stand out. But if I read a different version or translation, it sticks out. And so that's one reason I choose a different translation each year. And so for 2024, I selected Robert Alter's translation and commentary on the Hebrew Bible. And I'd come across this in a Catherine Project reading group I had done on the David story, and so that's 1st and 2nd Samuel, and Robert Alter calls it the David story. And then so we discussed that 1st and 2nd Samuel, and I just loved the commentary, the translation. Nothing really stood out on the translation, but almost half of each page has commentary about what you're reading, and I found it to be so helpful. Robert Alter would describe word choices and where that word showed up in other parts of the Hebrew Bible, why he translated it a certain way, and then would just kind of give deeper information on what you were reading. And so that was the version I read this year. I only read the full commentary for Genesis. I was planning to read all of it, but it took too much time, and there was no way I was going to get through the Bible in 2 months if I read all of the commentary by Robert Alter. So I do recommend this series if you're interested in taking a deeper dive into the Hebrew Bible. I just loved it, and then I have this as a resource. I kind of thought maybe later in life just picking a certain book of the Bible each year and going through all of his commentary on it, but just a great resource to have in a great version of the Bible. The version of the New Testament that I selected was David Bentley Hart's, and that one I enjoyed it as well. And one thing I really liked that he did is he would have a lot of the language of especially the Gospels and Acts, he would have it in the present tense. And apparently that's what the Greek does as well. But you'd be going along and then it's like, and then he says this. And you just, like, you're reading it and you get the idea that you're there. because it's not like, and then he said this, and then he did this, and then he said this, but it's like he says this, and he's saying this, and it just puts you right there. And I loved that immediacy of it. I loved that aspect of it being, something 2,000 years old, but like you feel like you're right there. And so that was something I really appreciated. I also just found some of the word choices interesting, and he would comment at the end of the translation. David Bentley Hart commented on why he chose some of those words. And again, it's just one of those things that goes into the whole reason that I read different versions and translations. So I was very happy to come across that and to see that. After the Bible, I got into Homer, and I read the Robert Fitzgerald translation in that second reading. And oh man, that second reading of the Iliad just it became my favorite book of all time. And it just there was so much in it. I read it for the first time in my life the year prior, so 2023, and then this was my second time reading it ever in my life. And again, I wish I had read it earlier in life, but I'm so glad I've read it now. And I actually did something else this year by reading it a third time, and I led a reading group on it locally here. So we met 9 different times, and that was a joy. And I read the Robert Fagel's translation for that reading, but the Iliad is just one of those books that you need to read if you haven't read it. I'll talk about it a little bit more in the next segment as well, but it is a special book. Is my new favorite, and there are such lovely and deep things in that book, and I've even thought about reading it every other year for the rest of my life, but we'll see how that goes. After Homer, I read Pindar, and Pindar was very hard for me. What Pindar does is talk about the Olympic athletes, but then ties in a bunch of mythology and to create these kind of stories around these Olympic athletes. And so it's very interesting in that sense. But the way I described it is that you almost needed like a graduate level of understanding of Greek mythology to read and understand that book. And I don't have anywhere near that. I consider myself maybe early elementary school understanding of Greek mythology. So I just had a hard time getting into that. I'm glad I read it. There are some fun things in it, like it says Achilles chased a deer, and it was a particular kind of deer, and I remember looking that up, and that deer can run something like 19 miles an hour or something. So it was just kind of this fun anecdote of like, Achilles can run 19 miles per hour, something impossible for a human, but just kind of fun things like that. And as I have read more Greek works and Greek literature, I've come across different notes, especially kind of footnotes where they say, we know this because of Pindar. Like we would not have this information about this Greek god or this if it weren't for having Pindar's works. So I'm glad I read it in that sense, but it was very difficult for me to get through. And I removed it from the great books list just because it is a great book, but if I'm trying to narrow down to like the top, I wouldn't have that one on there. After Pindar, I got into the tragedy writers. And so I started with Aeschylus. And with Aeschylus, I had so much trouble. And I think there are a few reasons why. One reason is just that I was moving from one genre to another. So I was going from kind of epic poetry, the epic poetry of Homer, which I'd been in for a while from between 2023 and 2024. I was going from that into a different type of writing and one that is based on dialogue and the limits of theater. And so I started with Aeschylus, and I had to read Aeschylus 4 times. I read the Orestia 4 times. It took me that many times to get through it. I also at that time had a difficult project with work, and I would just notice that anytime I would sit down to read, my mind would go right to that work project. And so I think that had part to do with it as well. But I'm really glad I took the time to read them over and over and over until I felt like I understood the story and what was going on. But it did take me that long with Aeschylus. I then went into Sophocles. Sophocles is my favorite tragedy writer. There were the Theban plays is his his main series. They're actually not. They weren't performed together, but they're often collected together in a book if you get a book of Sophocles. But I've really enjoyed some of his other tragedies that aren't as popular, like Philoctetes and Ajax. And so I loved Sophocles so much. I also read some fragments of Sophocles, and I'll talk more about some fragments later. Then I got into Euripides, and I read about half of his plays. I didn't get there. I decided to read all 19 of them and could only get through half of them this year. So I'll finish the rest of them in 2025, and I can't wait for that. My favorite was Medea. And just there's this idea in there that like you can't kill somebody. You can kill somebody. You can physically kill somebody, but there are things that will happen. There are furies that will attack your mind. There are things that you won't be able to get past for the rest of your life if you kill somebody. And that may seem super obvious, but just reading it in that sense, I thought of Crime and Punishment as I was reading that in the connection there of Crime and Punishment asking a similar question of can you kill somebody without there being further ramifications? Can you kill somebody and be able to look at the mirror at night? Can you do it without it impacting you on a deeper level? And what I think Medea shows is no, you can't. So stuff like that, just amazing things in these tragedies. I then read some history, so Thucydides and Xenophon, and one thing I wish is that I had read those before the tragedies, because the Thucydides covers the Peloponnesian War, and that is happening as these tragedy plays are being written and performed. They were performed in Athens. There'd be contests on what was the greatest tragedy play. And so you had Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides battling each other out in with these tragedies. And they're three of the four greatest tragedy writers in all of history. And the three of them, their lives overlapped. And I just find that fascinating. But it's interesting to be able to look at when the tragedy plays were written, when they were performed, but then to know what was going on in Greek history, and specifically with the Peloponnesian War during that time. So it was fun to read about it later in Thucydides, but I just wish I had placed Thucydides before the tragedy writers, just to kind of have a better scope of knowing what year and what was happening, and to see if there were kind of connection points in what the tragedy writers were writing about. Xenophon kind of takes the Peloponnesian War from 411 BC onward, and then gets into some other wars and history as well. And so that was very interesting to read. Herodotus is my favorite, Xenophon after that, and then Thucydides. I had a little trouble with Thucydides, a bit of a slog for me, but very interesting nonetheless. I read Aesop's Fables in my spring semester as well. I didn't like that because it was dealing with things that were not from Greece. So the fable would be something from Roman times or after. And I'm just thinking, okay, I thought Aesop was from Greece. Why are there Roman themes and that kind of thing? And I had just gotten like some basic Barnes and Noble edition of it. So I posted on that online, and somebody said, well, you need to get a Loeb version of the book, and it's called Babrius and Phaedrus. And that is Aesop's Fables, but they were collected by people and then written down. And so that book, I enjoyed that one a lot more. And then it had kind of some deeper information on what was going on. And so Aesop didn't write anything down himself, but his stories kind of were captured by these different people. And it offered a little better scope, and it was not as sanitized as the Barnes and Noble edition. So I enjoyed that. That was it for the great books. I'm going to get into some of the books that I read during my breaks here. So the first was The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. I read his other book for my The Coddling of the American Mind. I read that, I think, in 2018, and that had a really big impact on me. And so I was curious about this new book, and it definitely did not disappoint. Just very interesting to know what's going on, especially as I'm raising daughters, and my wife and I are just trying to figure out, how do you handle all of this with social media and devices and all that. So just seeing some of the evidence and charts and data, it's pretty eye opening. And I'll link to that podcast episode that I did about that book in the show notes. Another one was Theo of Golden, and that's a novel that I read late this year, so in December, and that just blew me away. It's by Alan Levi, and oh man, so good. If you get a chance, read that one. I wanted to be Theo, the main character, and there's not a lot of books where you read about someone and you're like, man, I want to be that person, but just at a level of they're living life well, and that was Theo, and it just. I gifted that book to 10 people over Christmas. Told a lot of people about it. A lot of people are writing me, telling me they have read it, and it's so good. Another one was The Art of Teaching, and that was just that impacted me a lot because I don't consider myself a teacher, but that book convinced me that I am a teacher, whether it's with this podcast or with my kids or just going around in life. And so I found that book to be very helpful and enjoyed it very much. A few more here that came up in the break months. Van Gogh Has a Broken Heart by Russ Ramsey. That is so good. I love art, and I love learning the stories of the artist. And what Russ Ramsey does in this book is highlight the struggles and the pain of these artists. I just kind of had in my mind, if somebody's creating something that is that beautiful, they must just be close to God. They must just be incredible human beings. And what you find out is they are very troubled people, but it was out of that suffering, it was out of those troubles that this artwork came about. And it's just a really incredible thing to think about, and to read these stories is amazing. Reminisce is another book I read by Suzanne Clark, and that was a delight. I really enjoyed that one. Next up was The Intellectual Life, and that I really enjoyed that. I have not covered it on the podcast yet, but it will come up in a episode here in the near future. But that one is just, if you're wanting to do this reading life, if that's something that you're doing right now, or it's something you desire to do to really have a life of the mind, this is a great place to start. Just kind of gives a background for why to do it, why it's important, and all that. And so I highly recommend The Intellectual Life. That'll do it for this segment. Next segment, I'll get into the one thing and share some of my top books for the year. All right, my one thing for the entire year of 2024 is this. I kept hearing about the great books, and then I kept hearing people talk about the great books as being the great conversation. And I never really understood what that meant until this year. And what I realized is that the part of what makes a book great is that it is in conversation with the other books. And you can kind of picture Homer as being the start. And you can read the Iliad, you can read the Odyssey, and you start seeing these ideas that are being brought up. And for us, it's the first time they're being brought up in literature that we can go back to. You've got a few older works. You've got stuff from Egypt. You've got Gilgamesh and Hedwana. You have other works that are before Homer, but Homer is where we see some ideas for the very first time in written format. And what you then see, and so I came across those, didn't really think much about them while I was reading the Iliad and the Odyssey, but then you get to the tragedy writers and you start to see these ideas being worked out more and more. And so maybe one of the tragedy writers will take an idea from the Iliad or from the Odyssey and then just go deep into it and look at it from the angle of giving you two impossible choices, or giving the main character two impossible choices along these ideas. And so what does one do in that circumstance? What would you do in that circumstance? And you kind of start asking those questions as you're going through it, just naturally, because you're witnessing somebody have to encounter some really difficult decisions. But they're along these ideas that have started in Homer, and Homer might not get very deep into the ideas or far into them, but the tragedy writers take them from there. And then my understanding is that the philosophers take them from there. So Plato and Aristotle, and then you have Saint Augustine who writes his work, but he uses the framework of the Odyssey for his work. And then you get to Nietzsche, and Nietzsche is writing a book about tragedy, but he's referring to the tragedies, the Greek tragedies. And so these books are speaking to one another. They're referencing one another. And I saw that before me. I understood it at a deeper level this year, and that's kind of my one main thing from this year. That idea that I had heard about the Great Conversation, it finally clicked in my head, and it became a reality. I understood what that meant, and I get so excited now to read these other books because they're referencing the books that I'm reading right now. And that's one huge argument for attempting to read these in chronological order, just because you'll see how these ideas expand and are shaped over time. You'll see where they're introduced, and then you'll see how they take a life of their own through different people, and how one author may take an idea from antiquity and just flip it on its head. But if you've read the book from antiquity, then you know what idea is being referenced and can go from there. And so that's my one thing for this year, the Great Conversation, and how that is playing out. And I can't wait for the next 13 or so years of this project to dig even deeper into that. Let me go into my top 5 books for the year. Again, you pick up any one of these, they are likely to be just incredible books for you if you're needing ideas for books to read. So the first one here is The Intellectual Life. Again, that just gave kind of like a good framework for why to read, how to think about reading, and then just some ideas and tips and tools and that kind of thing. So I'll probably highlight that in the next few weeks in the podcast here. After that, Theo of Golden, that book that I mentioned earlier, and it's the one I gifted the most to people this year. And I'm looking forward to hearing what they think of it. I was able to talk to the author as well after I read the book, and I'm trying to get that author to the bookstore where I am business manager in 2025. So I hope that works out, but just a delightful book. Next up was Philoctetes by Sophocles, and that one was just, I just remember it being where Odysseus has to try to convince Philoctetes to return to Troy for the Trojan War, and how Odysseus thinks that Odysseus is always known as the clever man, the man of tricks and twists and turns and all that, and so he tries to lure him to come by using lies, and he has Neoptolemus do this work, but Neoptolemus is more of this pure character who does not want to use lies to get him. And I just found it so interesting because you see very clearly that if the strategy is to lie, if that doesn't work, your alternative is violence. And that's what we see happen in this play, because if you lie and that doesn't work, the person will know that you have lied and will not trust anything else that you've said. And so you can't then come and say another lie, or even the truth is suspect at that point. And so you have to resort to violence to get your way. Whereas if you start with truth, if the first method of trying something doesn't work, you can try another method of truth. You can keep trying through persuasion. But if that first one, if you're lying, you have to resort to force. And the reason I thought this was so interesting is that in the Orestia, we see by Aeschylus, we see that law and democracy and deliberation were started by Athena in Athens at the Areopagus. And so throughout these works, you see this comparison of what I began calling Ares versus the Areopagus. And so Ares is the god of force, the god of war. And you contrast that with the Areopagus, where deliberation reigns and democracy and discussing things and that sort of thing. And so you see that contrast throughout literature and Greek literature here of Areopagus is where civilization starts. But forcing people to do things, that is not civilization, and that is not where ideas are going to thrive, and society and civilization are going to thrive. And so I liked seeing this in different aspects, and seeing it in Philoctetes, and just seeing how that play out at a personal level, but at the level of truth versus falsehood as well. And what that leads to. I just found it was very, very interesting. After that, Medea by Euripides, that was another favorite of mine this year. It was in my top 5. And that's where I came across that idea of you can't kill somebody. There are further ramifications, and that is a devastating tragedy play, just awful, but incredible in what you see in that. And top 5, the number 1, I would have to say the Iliad. It really on my second reading this year, and then on my third reading as well, it became something else for me. It became my new favorite book of all time, and one that I hope to return to often. Let me go into now just a few kind of like the greatest books or different categories here. And so the first is the greatest surprise. And for that, I would say the Greek epic fragments. And I felt like an archaeologist reading this book because Greek epic fragments cover the Trojan epic cycle. And so we have the Iliad, we have the Odyssey, but those were only 2 works out of a cycle of 8 works. And these works would have been known to the ancients. And so they would have had all of these stories, but we've lost 6 of them. We don't have them. But someone in antiquity did kind of a book review on, or a summary of all 8 of them. And so in these Greek epic fragments, you have the summary, but then you also have different fragments that have shown up in Aristotle or other works where we don't have the full work anymore, but these authors referenced fragments of them. And so I just love, it's a Loeb, one of those green Loeb books, and it's called Greek Epic Fragments. And it goes through what we know from this. And one thing that just startled me is that in that first work of that Trojan epic cycle, we learn about the will of Zeus. And the will of Zeus was to wipe out all of humanity. And so in the Iliad, the very first section of the Iliad, we hear about the will of Zeus being worked out. And when you read the Iliad, you're just thinking, okay, what is the will of Zeus? Like, is it he's got some plan and then he forces people to do that plan? Or does he work all of humanity's plans together for his will? Like, what's actually going on here? And what was the Greek conception of the will of Zeus? And so you're wondering the whole time you're reading the Iliad, because you could go one way or the other kind of throughout the book. In some parts, it just seems like Zeus has all the power. And then in other parts, there seems to be something above Zeus, above the will of Zeus, that is calling the shots. And so he can't even save his own son in one part. But just that perennial question of the will of Zeus, how much power does this god have? And then in that first work in the Greek epic fragments, you see that the will of Zeus is something in particular, and it's to get rid of humankind. But Homer doesn't reference that, and so you just wonder, was Homer thinking of that? Was because the audience would have been thinking of that, of the will of Zeus that they had read about in this other work. But either way, I loved that. That was my first introduction to fragments as well. And so I decided to read all of the fragments of the tragedy writers that we have as well. And it's just so cool. It's very exciting of you'll read a fragment and you just kind of wonder, like, what was the connotation or what was the situation that the characters were in when this was said? Because sometimes it's like wisdom literature. I mean, it's just great stuff. Like you're reading this, you're like, I wonder what the context was. Like, who said it to who? What and so with these fragments, it's just kind of fun reading through those. And like I said, it just really makes you feel like an archaeologist of sorts, but of literature. New favorite, Iliad. The hardest book I read this year was Pindar. The biggest slog was Thucydides. The most delightful was Theo of Golden. And the best for the reading life is that book, The Intellectual Life. I want to share a few things that just kind of, I call it my bookish life. I am the business manager at a bookstore. I love books. When I travel, I go to bookstores. I get the chance to meet authors through the year, and I'm inundated with the bookish life, and it's so much fun. But I love sharing kind of some things that happened throughout 2024 that were interesting to me. One was that I spoke to a few classes. So there's a local high school here in Franklin, Tennessee, and I spoke to the senior class, and these are just some very bright students. And I just talked about reading and the reading life and what that looks like and how I've gone about it. And they asked excellent questions, and I just had a great time doing that. I also spoke to a college class over Zoom at Pepperdine. And again, I talked about the reading life and that sort of thing, and had a great time doing that. For the first time in my life, I led a reading group, and I led that on the Iliad. We met 9 times, and in person. I did not do that one online. And that was very interesting. It was fun because only a few people in the group had read the Iliad. So a lot of people were coming to it for the first time, and just to hear their thoughts, hear their first impressions was amazing. I do just kind of want to move in that direction as well of teaching and leading groups like that. And so I enjoyed doing that one. I do hope to do more in the future. And in fact, I am doing more in 2025. I'll highlight that in a minute here, but I specifically want to do more with high school students, because I think if you can introduce high school students to some of these great works, they will set the stage for the rest of your life. And especially with the Iliad, like once you have read the Iliad, and that opens up so much, because so much is referencing the Iliad, so much is talking about the Iliad, or ideas that come up, or characters that come up in the Iliad. You will hear things throughout your life that are direct references to the Iliad. Just even some of the characters of Achilles and Hector and Helen of Troy and all that. So read the Iliad if you haven't, but that was a delight to lead that group. I also took part in a few reading groups. So those were the Catherine Project reading groups. One was on the Orestia by Aeschylus that kind of coincided with exactly when I was reading those works. And that was so helpful because, as I mentioned earlier, I had a lot of trouble with Aeschylus. It took me a long time to understand it, and just being part of that group really helped. And then I did the group on Thucydides and Xenophon as well. I got to meet some incredible authors and authors that I look up to a lot this year. I had the chance to meet Malcolm Guite. I'd met him earlier for an event we had done, but this time I got to spend quite a bit of time in the car with him. I asked him what he thought heaven was like, and he responded with quotes from Plato, Aristotle, C.S. Lewis, and just like he just wove it together so beautifully and brilliantly, and that was such a delight to hear that. I got to interview Dr. Kirsten Jeffrey Johnson, who is the world's foremost expert on George MacDonald, and that was just incredible. My whole thinking of George MacDonald shifted. I'd kind of been, I'd heard my whole life a certain version of George MacDonald's life, and what she says is that's not the whole story, or there are even parts of that are vastly incorrect. And so, just talking to her really helped me in understanding George MacDonald better. And that was for an event. And so that video is live, and that was a delight. I also got to meet and talk to Karen Swallow Pryor this year, and that, again, was for an event at Landmark Booksellers. I love her works. I'm going to use her 6 versions of the classics where she introduces them, has questions throughout, and I'll be using her versions for the when I come to those in the Great Books project. Overarching insights for the year. I've hit on some of these just in talking about some of the books earlier in this episode, but that Aries versus Areopagus, I would say that's probably the biggest idea through the year. I kept seeing that come up. And again, that's force versus deliberation. That's war versus dialogue. And you see it's come up so much in kind of the Greeks working that out. And another insight from the year was seeing a lot of these ideas pop up, whether it's in the Iliad or in the tragedies or in the Odyssey, and then reading the history by Thucydides and Xenophon. And what you see is the Athenians kind of grappling with these ideas. So they've got these high ideas for how things should work and how people should be treated, and deliberating on things versus forcing people to do things. And yet you see in real politics, you see in real life, force having to be used more than perhaps they thought in their philosophy and in their works. And so it's just really interesting to see how those things would actually play out in their history, as opposed to these great ideas we see in their works. Another overarching idea is just that will of Zeus. And so what does that mean? What was the Greek conception of Zeus, of the gods, and how much sway did the gods have in their lives? And what did they believe about that? And you obviously see that shift over time. You even see that shift within the tragedy writers on their views of the gods. And so the view of the gods in Homer is going to be a lot different than in the tragedy writers, a lot different, I assume, from what I'll find in the Greek philosophy as well. So just kind of interesting to see that happen. This last thing I want to say in this section of like overarching insights is just, this was the first year where, well, let me put it this way. I try to encourage everyone I come across to read the great books and to read different works. And I preface this by saying, I was scared getting into these works. I didn't think I would understand them. I thought I would have to have a university degree to read these, but that's really not the case. Like you can pick up a lot of these books and just read them and get a lot out of them. And yes, the more you dig in, the more you'll get out of them. But this was the first year where I thought, you really have to have a background in mythology to deeply appreciate these great works. You don't have to. You can just go into the Iliad and read it. And that's what I did. I actually read a few books of mythology before, but I'm like I said, I'm on like the elementary level of understanding Greek mythology. But the point is, like, the more you know, the richer these works come. And that's an obvious statement, but like with Greek mythology, it's this overarching world where everything fits within that. And so stories are being referenced and people are being referenced. And if you don't know the full story, the full mythology, you're going to miss so much. And so I'll say it again, you can read these works without having understood like Greek mythology or that kind of thing, but you will get so much more out of them if you take that time and kind of get a background in mythology. One way to get that background, though, is to just start reading the works, because you'll start picking up on it. You'll start picking up in the tragedies. But I would start with like Edith Hamilton's mythology, or the Homeric hymns, or the Theogony by Hesiod. These are just great works to help you kind of understand the overall mythology that's going on. Now, things I wish I had done differently. One is that I just wish that I'd read Thucydides before the tragedies. And then the other is that wish I had just read Babrius and Phaedrus instead of reading like a generic version of Aesop's fables. But otherwise, I'm really happy with how I'm going about this in a roughly chronological order, because that is just, it's helping me see these ideas move throughout time. And I strongly suggest if you are going to do the great books, no matter how many you decide to read, just try to do them in chronological order, because you will see these ideas spread through time. Now, going into 2025, I am doing a few things here. One is I'm renaming the great books to the immortal books. I guess I've always had an issue with the term the great books, because I hear all the time people say, oh, this book is great. This is a great book. This is a great book. But they're not. They just mean that the book was great. They really enjoyed it. But the great books, there is a thing called the great books, where there is a certain list of books, and you can find different lists. But there are quite a few books that show up on almost every single one of those lists. And these are the great books. And that's, to me, in my mind, there should be some gravitas to that. There should be something that sets these books apart from other ones that people just say are great. And so I'm going to start referring to the great books as the immortal books. And that may be a bit overkill, but to me, these are the books that will never die. These books will be around for all time. And the ideas that are in them, they are ideas that have stood the test of time. They are works that have stood the test of time. They are works that impact us today. They are works that will last throughout time. And so I'm going to start calling them the immortal books instead of the great books. And I hope it catches on. I just hope it kind of inspires people to look into these books and to start reading some of them, and to know that it's not just another good book you're going to pick up. These are immortal books. They have ideas that can change you, that can change your life, and there is a gravitas to them that doesn't get captured in that term, the great books. So I'm having fun with that, but I will start referring to them as the immortal books. And then in 2025 here, I'm going to finish the tragedies. I just have Euripides remaining, and then I'll move into the Greek comedies. So there's one writer, Aristophanes, and I've gotten all of his works, and so I'm going to go through those. Then I have a little bit of Greek history remaining. So I've got a few other works by Xenophon, and then I get into philosophy. So I'm going to do Plato and Aristotle. So this will be another year of heavily Greek works, and but a shift kind of from the tragedies into the comedies, finishing up the history, and then getting into philosophy. I've always been quite scared of the philosophy, just even in college courses and that sort of thing. It was always beyond me. I didn't understand it, but I'm really curious now to read Plato and Aristotle after having read the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the tragedies, because they're pulling ideas from there. And so I can't wait to get into those. And I think I'll have a better experience this time around than just going in cold to the philosophers. Last thing I want to highlight here is that I am going to be leading a reading group in 2025, and it'll be both in person and a separate one that is online. I would love for you to join that. All you need to do to join the online one is to become a paid subscriber on my Substack for this project, Books of Titans. I have plans as little as $5 per month. So for like the cost of a cup of coffee, you can join in on this reading group. And I've selected 12 great, short, great books, and I'll call those great books for now, just term it out instead of short, immortal books. But they're short, great books, and they're ones like the Epic of Gilgamesh. We'll read some of the tragedy writers like Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, and then we'll get into other works like Man's Search for Meaning, so something a little more modern. But we'll do one a month. It'll just be one meeting per month and one book per month. And so I'd love if you bought the book from Landmark Booksellers as well. You'll see links in the show notes to this reading group. But if you just want to join the online, the one requirement is to become a paid subscriber to there on Substack. If you live in the Franklin or Nashville area, I will be leading the reading groups on the first Monday of each the second Monday of each month at Landmark Booksellers. So take a look at the list. You don't have to do all of them. You can jump in and out on the books that are of most interest to you. But I would love that. And especially if you just have a desire to get into the great books and maybe don't know where to start. One thing I hope that this reading group does is to just lower the bar of entry. Like the Epic of Gilgamesh is just incredible. And you will be so surprised at how modern that book feels, despite it being written almost 4,000 years ago. And so I just want to get people comfortable with reading the great books and reading these books that have stood the test of time, that have been around for some of them thousands of years, and to just open that avenue up for you. That's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. 2024 was an incredible year of reading. It was my best so far of my life. It just keeps getting better. And I'm so thankful that you have followed this journey with me. I love sharing what I'm learning. And so I hope you get stuff out of these episodes, and it introduces you to books that you may want to read, or maybe reminds you of books that you have read. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter. It's at Books of Titans. And I have a website at books.booksoftitans.com that has all of my reading lists. It has the Immortal Books reading list there, and just a way for you to find books that you may want to read and to create your own reading list. I'll be back in a week or two, and with another book, probably that Intellectual Life book. I also want to do an episode coming up that highlights my 2025 reading list and what I have coming up. So until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.